You're watching Reuters TV. Here are your top stories.
A policy meant to help victims of terror could vanish.
The Champs-Elysees gunman was a former convict who'd served time for assaults on police.
A new dystopian series that hits a little too close to home.
This is Reuters Now.
Raj is a Sri Lankan fisherman who sought asylum in the U.S. after he was kidnapped by Tamil Tiger separatists. But there was a catch. A U.S. judge determined that the $500 ransom he paid to escape the rebels amounted to material support for terrorists. After years in immigration detention, Raj was granted a waiver under rules for people who may have supported terrorists under duress. He settled in San Diego and now has a green card. He asked Reuters not to show his face or use his full name.
Thank you very much.
But U.S. President Donald Trump is considering abolishing these sort of waivers, and that could affect more than just one Sri Lankan fisherman. Reuters Washington correspondent June Torbati.
U.S. immigration law has a very broad definition for what terrorism is, and it's a definition that encompasses armed groups that fought authoritarian regimes, as well as payments made to a terrorist group under duress or under force. So if this policy change goes through, those individuals who fall under those definitions would be barred from the United States and would have really no legal recourse.
Such waivers have been granted to Kurdish groups that battled Saddam Hussein and persecuted members of the Hmong ethnic minority in Vietnam and the Karen in Myanmar.
America is the most generous nation on immigration. We admit 1.1 million people a year.
Immigration hardliners, such as U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions, have warned the waivers pose a security risk. Asked to identify a case of a waiver recipient engaging in a terrorism-related case, a U.S. Customs and Immigration spokesman referred Reuters to the FBI, which referred the question to the State Department. A State Department official could not point to examples of beneficiaries who have, quote, gotten into trouble after arriving.
The water crisis in Flint, Michigan focused national attention on the dangers of lead exposure, and over the past year, Reuters has found more than 3,300 neighborhoods across the United States where childhood lead poisoning rates are at least twice as high as Flint's. Now, President Trump is pushing for steep budget cuts that experts say could cause more children to suffer the lifelong effects of lead exposure. I'm Andy Sullivan in Washington, outside the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, one of the federal government's frontline agencies in the fight against lead. HUD Secretary Ben Carson told Congress that he had seen firsthand the devastating effects of childhood lead poisoning when he worked as a surgeon in inner-city Baltimore. He's now asking Congress for $20 million more for his main lead abatement program. But that pales in comparison to the billions of dollars in cuts that the Trump administration is seeking from other efforts, such as cleanup, enforcement, and affordable housing. Advocates say that if Trump's budget is enacted, it would strand countless children in dangerous, contaminated homes. Those cuts would mean less help for families like the Chowdhuries in Buffalo, New York. When their 2-year-old daughter was found to have high levels of lead in her blood, local officials used federal money to install a new roof and replace windows and siding that were coated with lead paint. The father in the family, M.D. Chowdhury, took classes to learn how to safely remove lead paint himself. All that money would disappear if Trump got his way. It's unclear whether Trump will get anywhere with these proposed budget cuts when Congress returns at the end of April. Lawmakers from both parties say they're going to try to expand lead poisoning prevention programs, not cut them. But even if this budget is dead on arrival, it's a clear statement of priorities from the Trump administration. In the wake of the Flint crisis, the fight against lead ranks low on their list.
A police raid on the home of the suspected Champs-Elysees gunman, French national Karim Churfi. Neighbours painting a picture of a former convict who lived with his mother, usually sitting glued to his computer, hardly ever leaving home. Churfi was well known by authorities and had served time for armed assaults on police going back 16 years. While in prison, he shot and wounded a prison officer after seizing his gun. He was arrested again this year on suspicion of preparing an attack on police. After Thursday's attack, Reuters' Julien Pretot was one of the first journalists to arrive.
We arrived at the scene about 15-20 minutes after the shooting, and police were looking very, very nervous. We spoke to a witness who said he fears for his life. He was next to the police van when the shooting happened, says he thought he was going to die. Because the Champs-Elysees are a very, very crowded area, especially in springtime. You know, in the early hours of the night, it's very crowded. But he was really targeting only the policemen.
In the car Churfi drove on Thursday, police found a pump-action shotgun and knives. Having driven up to a police van, he targeted it using what's thought to be a Kalashnikov rifle. By the time it was over, a policeman was dead, and so was he. 2 other people left wounded. Investigators finding a note next to the suspect's body defending Islamic State. As France prepares to vote on Sunday, far-right anti-immigrant presidential candidate Marine Le Pen seizing on Thursday's attack, calling to immediately reinstate border checks and expel foreigners on watch lists. Authorities say they're now hunting for a second suspect who may still be at large. An uneasy but not uncommon prospect for a nation already living in a state of emergency. Since 2015, terror-related attacks here have killed more than 230 people.
I'm also issuing 2 directives that instruct Secretary Mnuchin to review the damaging Dodd-Frank regulations that fail to hold Wall Street firms accountable. I mean, they've done really, in many cases, the opposite of what they were supposed to. These regulations enshrine too big to fail and
a deadly attack on an Afghan military base. Taliban fighters dressed in military uniforms talking their way through checkpoints before opening fire. Soldiers were targeted as they ate dinner and left a mosque following Friday prayers. There's conflicting reports on the death toll. The Defence Ministry confirming it is over 100 soldiers killed. Officials speaking anonymously put it at least 140. This man, a nearby resident, says he heard some explosions which sounded like rockets before the fighting began. The Taliban claiming the attack in a statement. Up to 10 of its fighters are believed to have infiltrated the base in the northern city of Mazar-e-Sharif. The major headquarters is often used by foreign military advisors. However, no international troops were involved in Friday's attack. The Western-backed Afghan government has locked in a prolonged war with Taliban insurgents and other militant groups.
What we do every night is like something out of a strange dream, except that the next morning, it all makes sense. To power global e-commerce, FedEx networks are massive, far-reaching, and yes, a little magical.
Campaigning over, there's nothing more candidates in the first round of elections in France can do to convince voters to support them. And it's still not clear who will triumph in Sunday's vote. The first round will send 2 of 11 candidates into a runoff in 2 weeks' time. The winner of that will become France's new president. And it's a vote which could change not only France, but the global political landscape. Centrist candidate Emmanuel Macron is currently polling as favourite, but Front National candidate Marine Le Pen is not far behind him. Her party's far-right, anti-immigrant stance has been gaining traction, and continues to do so in the wake of an attack in Paris Thursday, which saw a policeman killed. France has suffered a number of attacks in the past months, and the country will go to the polls under tight security. More than 50,000 police and other security mobilised for the day. Both Le Pen and Macron have passionate supporters and detractors, but despite pollsters' findings, neither is totally assured a spot in the May 7th runoff for president. Conservative François Fillon and hard-left Jean-Luc Mélenchon remain in the running and have been gaining traction. Even as voters in French territories outside of mainland Europe start to vote, it's far from clear what's next for France.
The financial fallout from the video showing an elderly man getting dragged off a United flight nearly 2 weeks ago, reaching all the way to the chief executive's office. The board of directors pulling an offer to make current CEO Oscar Munoz chairman of the board next year, a regulatory filing revealed on Friday. And that's not all. Munoz's 2017 compensation will be directly tied to how consumers view the airline. United took a beating in public opinion after the video sparked outrage around the world, especially since passengers were being bumped to make room for United employees. And Munoz didn't do much to help his or the airline's image after numerous apologies failed to address the passenger, Dr. Dow. On a call with Wall Street analysts and media earlier this week, Munoz said the responsibility over the public relations nightmare stopped with him. The mishap now costing him part of his future.
Volkswagen on Friday put on 3 years of probation in the U.S., in which the automaker will be under the watchful eye of an independent monitor approved by the court. It was also hit with a $2.8 billion criminal fine as part of the total $4.3 billion federal settlement it agreed to in January. The federal judge who delivered the ruling in Detroit expressing shock at what he called, quote, a case of deliberate and massive fraud, and ordered the world's biggest automaker to make significant reforms. Volkswagen pleaded guilty in March to fraud, lying, and obstruction of justice for installing secret software in over 500,000 U.S. vehicles, cheating on emissions tests. But the scandal is not totally put to rest. Volkswagen has pledged up to $25 billion to compensate U.S. drivers and dealers. And it still faces the outcome of a criminal probe in its home country, Germany.
The TV adaptation of Margaret Atwood's dystopian novel The Handmaid's Tale is heading to Hulu. And on Friday, the creators of the show premiered the series at the Tribeca Film Festival. Originally published in 1985, the book imagined a totalitarian society where women are forced into sexual servitude and pollution has caused widespread infertility and a shrinking population. Reuters correspondent Jill Sargent was at the premiere.
This series, it's creating a lot of buzz at the moment. And that's because, although it was written in 1985, it seems to land at a very kind of relevant time, especially in the United States. It's landing at a time when women, in particular, feel that their reproductive rights and their fundamental civil rights are under threat.
So women's rights have been in jeopardy for a long, long time, and it's only getting worse. So I think it's, if people take a good reminder from it, then that's great.
The fiction has become closer to reality, and I think there are certain themes which are very prescient. Women's rights, autonomy on their bodies and decisions, I think, the environment.
The show's producer says the story is not just relevant, but a cautionary tale as well.
So it's just that awareness, raising awareness about not taking the rights that we have for granted, and also how quickly things can change in an instant.
The 10-part series premieres April 26th.
The retail graveyard is getting a new entrant, BB Stores. The struggling retailer updating store closure plans Friday. It will now close the doors on all of its 180 U.S. locations by the end of May, selling everything in them. I'm Conway Gittins in New York. Most of the retail sector is in pain, but BB's wounds are largely self-inflicted. Its women's apparel line has been described as something a female might wear at a club. Tight, risque, sexy, and former customers say the quality of the merchandise is too poor. The end result, women have not been shopping at BB for quite some time. It's been losing money for 4 years straight. BB is just the latest to succumb to a changing retail environment where the right fashion at the right price has made Amazon king and fast fashion retailers like H&M queen. Scroll through BB's website and you'll find simple jumpers and maxi dresses for more than $100. Go to H&M and you'll find something to wear at a fraction of the cost. BB not saying much about whether it will keep going as an online marketplace or just simply disappear in bankruptcy.
You're up to date. Check back later as stories develop.